Welcome back. All right, so last time we talked about stakeholders and how stakeholders should influence how you speak to your audience. This time we're going to be talking about broadly the rhetoric of media, and this is the second part of appealing to your audience. So once you've figured out who your stakeholders are and how to speak to them, then this is more specifically how tactics that you can take to speak effectively to your audience. Required notes as always. So the guy Aristotle, ancient Greek, he's kind of considered the father of rhetoric. And so this is just a nice little quote from Aristotle. It is the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it. So if you think of the stakeholders from the previous one, think of, the hunter speaking to this bear who's saying, hey, wait a second, um, if you're using rhetoric effectively, then you're going to be able to make the bear listen to what you're saying, and you're going to be more effective if you're able to convince him that you're willing to be listened to, and rhetoric or you're worth listening to. And your rhetoric, your use of rhetoric is really going to help that, in addition to everything that we talked about in the previous slide. So today, we're going to be talking about and getting ready to understand the definition and basic parts of rhetoric, how to apply rhetoric to media presentations, and how to begin understanding how to or see how to use rhetoric in our own pieces of media. And so again, this is in conjunction to the stakeholder stuff. You can't just forget the stakeholder stuff. You have to use this as you're thinking about your stakeholders and how you're going to speak to your stakeholders and what you're going to bring up and how you're going to bring those things up with them. So quickly, a definition of rhetoric. Rhetoric is language that is designed to have a persuasive or impressive effect on its audience. And so you use three rhetorical appeals for that. You use ethos, pathos, and logos in terms of rhetoric. And so again, if we're thinking about that cartoon from the last video with the bear, then and you know that the bear is a stakeholder, and you know what the bear would and wouldn't be willing to do, and all, and why the bears feel strongly about this, then if you know how to use ethos, pathos, and logos effectively, then you're going to be able to convince the bear that your solution to whatever problem you're proposing is the right solution. So we're going to start with ethos. Ethos is an authority on the topic, and I've included a little cartoon down at the bottom for you that just gives you a little bit more of an idea. So if you'd like to pause the video and look at the cartoon, it may help you. But what I'm going to talk about is when you're establishing yourself as an authority on the topic, which you may want to do in your video while you're talking to your stakeholders, how should you present yourself? So if you're going to establish yourself as an authority on the topic, then you need to correctly use domain-specific vocabulary. Like, you need to sound like you know what you're talking about, right? You come across these words in your research, you need to use them correctly in your speech. You need to anticipate questions, and you need to have answers ready. You don't want to be caught off guard. If you're an authority on the topic, you need to be able to speak as though you know what you're talking about. So you need to know what kinds of questions would be asked. You need to speak surely and confidently. You don't want to sound as though you're guessing. You don't want to sound as though you're fishing. You want to sound as though, even if you don't know what you're talking about, you always want to sound as though you're confident in whatever it is that you're saying. And then you also want to dress as an expert would on your topic. So, for example, if you were a hunter, let's just use that example, then a hunter is going to dress in a specific way. You're not going to look like an authority on hunting if you're dressed in a suit and tie, right? And vice versa. If if you're a businessman, you're not going to sound like an authority, look like an authority if you're dressed in hunting garb. And then you also want to avoid careless mistakes, because people who know what they're doing, who are authorities on their topics, aren't going to make mistakes. That's how people are going to perceive them. And then you want to think about, how do you present your information? So you want to present your information by citing credible and reputable sources. You want to make sure that you're not citing information that comes from some wonk off in left field. You really want to make sure that you're citing information that makes sense, that comes from a source that can be trusted, and from other sources that are also authorities on your topic. You want to make sure that your work is neat and flawless, because the neater it is and the less flawed it is, the more people are going to trust that you know what you're talking about. Next, we want to talk about pathos, and pathos is all about establishing emotional connections to the topic. So if you've established yourself as an authority, that's one thing, but it doesn't necessarily make anybody emotionally connected to your topic. So again, there's a cartoon. If you'd like to pause it and look at it, you can. But I'm going to talk about how to present yourself in ways that establish emotional connections to your topic. So you can present yourself by demonstrating that you're invested in the topic, demonstrating that you care about the topic, demonstrating that it's something that means something to you, right? And the way that you talk about it, the way that you interact with the topic is all going to do that. And then be passionate about your involvement. So evoke feelings of anger, evoke feelings of sadness, evoke feelings of elation or happiness, evoke feelings of excitement or humor. All of those are emotional connections that are going to help get your audience on your side if you use them strategically, and then lastly, you want to be tugging at heartstrings. You want to be making people feel those emotions, right? Like give them a reason to feel the emotions that you are feeling about this topic. There are ways that you can present information that will evoke emotion as well. So one way is to share personal stories of people affected by your topic. If you're talking, if we go back again to the hunter example, if you're a hunter and you're talking about how important hunting is to your family, then you share a personal story about that, and people are going to feel like they're connected to you. They're going to feel like they're invested in the thing that you're trying to accomplish. And you want to bring in real people. So you want to bring in, personal pictures. You want to bring in interviews. You want to bring in people who really do have that connection to the topic, people who really do care about it, people who are going to express something that's going to get your audience on your side for that. And finally, you want to establish real and relatable situations. You want to say, you don't want to speak hypothetically unless that hypothetical situation is something that your audience can relate to, right? Like if you're trying to convince a bear that hunting him is important for the survival of your family, then you want to talk to the bear in a way that the bear feels a connection to hunting. And bears, if you're trying to convince a bear that you should be allowed to hunt bears, then you probably want to talk to the bear about how important hunting is to that bear, because that's going to establish that emotional connection to the hunting as well, right? The bear is going to feel the importance because bears hunt themselves, right? So telling stories is going to be important. The last part of rhetoric is logos, and that's a logical foundation to your claim. So we've got authority, we've got emotion, but then there's also logic. And again, if you'd like to pause the video and look at the cartoon, that's perfectly fine. I'm going to talk about how to present yourself logically. So one way is to act rationally. So you don't want to give in to your emotions. Whereas you may be using emotions, you don't want to be submitting to your emotions. You don't want to be giving into them and turning into an emotional monster, an emotional wreck, right? So act rationally. You want to be able to look at information without a spin, which means you want to be able to step outside of your own perspective. On one hand, you want to be able to identify the emotional aspects, and on the other hand, you want to be able to say, I understand why somebody else might not see it this way, right? That's going to be seeing information without a spin. And so one way that you do that is you watch out for something called logical fallacies, which we'll get to in just a second. So how do you present information logically? Well, you use things like charts. Charts are very rational, right? You can't argue with a chart if the information is real. You just use it. You use graphs. You use statistics. You draw logical conclusions. You don't draw a conclusion that's a logical fallacy, which again I'm going to get to in just a second. So one logical fallacy which would lead to an illogical conclusion that you want to avoid is what we call the post hoc logical fallacy. And that's when a person assumes that one thing is caused by another thing simply because the other thing happened first. So you want to avoid that, right? Like you want to have a logical connection. You can't just assume, well, this thing happened, so this other, and then this other thing happened, so the first thing must cause the second thing. That's not necessarily true, right? So um, one example of a logical fallacy, a post hoc logical fallacy, would be saying, we won the election because I combed my hair backwards this morning. Well, we all know that combing your hair backwards has nothing to do with winning an election. So if you said, I combed my hair backwards, I won the election, therefore combing my hair backwards leads to winning elections, well, no, that's a post hoc logical fallacy. And there are infinite number of post hocs that you can come to. Second logical fallacy is the slippery slope logical fallacy, and that's the suggestion that one action leads to other actions which end in a disastrous conclusion. So a lot of people give in to this slippery slope. If you don't do this, then this other thing will happen, and pretty soon the world is going to come to an end. That's a slippery slope logical fallacy, and people don't respond well to that. So if you say something like, if we don't stop illegal immigration, then more people will come to our country and all of our jobs will disappear, that's slippery slope, right? Obviously, a ton of other things could possibly happen. And so you want to stay away from slippery slopes like that because people are not going to listen to those. Logical fallacy number 3 is the appeal to pity, and this is basically misusing pathos. Like you don't want to misuse pathos, because if you use it too much, then you're replacing logic with compassion, and people don't respond well to that as well. So if you say, I had to stand up so long that my back started to hurt, so I'm not going to do work, I'm not going to do my work very well. Well, you know, the fact that your back hurts doesn't necessarily mean that your work can't be very good, right? And so you're appealing to pity, and then by appealing to pity, some people are going to say, yeah, that's not really related, and so I don't really like, I don't see the connection there. So you want to avoid appealing to pity. On one hand, you want to use pathos. On the other hand, you don't want to use it so much that people don't see any logic behind it. Fourth, sorry, and the last one is the appeal to authority, or the last one that we're going to go over anyway. And so that's when you use an expert or other influential person to support an argument, even though they may lack expertise in that area. So this would be a misuse of ethos. In other words, maybe you get a doctor to talk about cancer, but he's not really a doctor on cancer. He's a doctor of the heart, and so you're appealing to authority. This is a doctor who doesn't know anything about, or doesn't know enough about cancer to speak as an authority, but you're using his authority to say something that he shouldn't be talking about, and that is a false appeal to authority. So here's an example. I'm really rich. I have my name on lots of buildings and I speak really loud, so that will make me able to stop global terrorism. Well, okay, he might be rich, which makes him an authority on being rich, and he might have buildings and he might speak really loud, which makes him authorities on a lot of things, but not necessarily global terrorism. And so that's a false appeal to authority. So lastly, and this should go fairly quick, you want to be able to balance all three of these. You want to, in order to use rhetoric effectively and get people on your side and agreeing with what you're saying, you want to balance the three. So you'll have a main appeal, which you will rely most heavily on. So you have to decide, are you going to appeal mainly to logos or ethos or pathos? And then you'll support that appeal by equally using the support appeals. If logos is your main appeal, then ethos and pathos are going to be your supporting appeals, meaning you don't use those as much as you use logos. And this can lead to a well-balanced and convincing argument if you use rhetoric this way. So, for example, if you want to make a mainly logical argument, you should periodically support that your logical points with authority and emotion. And so if we look here, you can see we've put logos at the top of the pyramid and ethos and pathos down below supporting it, and that leads to balanced rhetoric. You could do it in another way. You could make ethos at top or pathos at top, and then logos would be moved down to a support. But you have to be clear on which one are you going to use the most. Are you going to use, in this case, logos, right? And if you look at it then, if we remove pathos and you're just using logos and ethos, then the whole pyramid would crumble down. So you have to be able to use all three. But if you remove logos and you're just using ethos and pathos, then you have no point. You're not making a strong point. So you have to be able to use all three, but you also have to know which one you're going to rely most heavily on.